On a serene April afternoon in 1997, the Liled family, Vidar, Delfina, 6-year-old Tabitha, and 2-year-old Peter, were returning home from a religious convention. A chance encounter at a Tennessee rest stop with 6 youths from Kentucky led to an unthinkable act of violence. This is the harrowing story of the Liled family murders. Vidar Liled was born in Bergen, Norway, a picturesque city surrounded by mountains and fjords. His life in Norway was one of tranquility, deeply rooted in faith and a strong sense of family. In 1985, seeking new opportunities and a fresh start, he made the life-changing decision to move to the United States. His journey led him to Florida, where he found work and began adjusting to life in a new country. It was in Miami where he met Delfina Zelaya, a young woman of Honduran descent who had grown up in the bustling streets of New York City. Despite their different backgrounds, they found a common ground in their deep faith as Jehovah's Witnesses. Their connection was undeniable, built on shared beliefs and a vision for a peaceful life devoted to family and spirituality. In 1989, they married and soon welcomed their first child, Tabitha, in 1990. Their second child, Peter, followed in 1995, completing their small but joyful family. As Jehovah's Witnesses, the Lileds were known for their unwavering devotion to their faith. They spent much of their time engaged in ministry work, spreading their religious beliefs, attending meetings, and actively participating in their congregation. Vidar was known as a kind and gentle man, someone who was always willing to lend a helping hand. Delfina was equally warm-hearted, deeply loving toward her children, and fully dedicated to her role as a mother. However, life in Miami and later New York was not what they envisioned for their growing family. The fast-paced environment, crime, and rising concerns about safety led them to seek a quieter, more peaceful place to raise their children. That search brought them to Knoxville, Tennessee. The rolling hills, slower pace of life, and welcoming community felt like the perfect place to settle down. They believed they had found their safe haven, a place where their children could grow up in a nurturing, faith-centered environment, away from the troubles of big cities. To outsiders, the Lileds were the picture of a happy, loving family. Vidar and Delfina were devoted to each other and to their faith, raising their children with strong moral values. 6-year-old Tabitha was a bright and cheerful child, full of curiosity and energy. She loved singing and had already developed a strong connection to the family's faith. Peter, just 2 years old, was still discovering the world around him, often clinging to his mother and sister for comfort. By April 1997, the Lileds had fully settled into their Tennessee home. Their days were spent in quiet devotion, attending meetings, and working to instill their faith in their children. They were well-liked in their community, known for their kindness and gentle nature. But in an instant, their world would be shattered. A routine trip to a Jehovah's Witness convention in Johnson City would place them in the path of 6 strangers who carried with them a darkness that would change everything. The 6 individuals who would forever be tied to one of Tennessee's most haunting crimes came from small towns in Kentucky, places where opportunity was scarce and escape felt impossible. They were young, restless, and searching for something they believed they had finally found in each other. But this desperate need for belonging would lead them down a path of no return. Natasha Cornett, 18, was born on January 26, 1979 in Betsy Lane, Kentucky, a small, impoverished community where dreams rarely came true. Her childhood was anything but stable. Her mother, Madonna Wallen, struggled to make ends meet, and her father was largely absent. At first glance, Natasha seemed like a bright, artistic girl with potential. She had a sharp wit and a magnetic personality that attracted people to her. But beneath the surface, her world was unraveling. Academically, she struggled. A once promising student, she began skipping classes and fell behind. She dropped out of high school before completing 9th grade. She battled severe mental health issues, later diagnosed with bipolar disorder and anorexia, conditions that went largely untreated. By 14, she was experimenting with drugs and alcohol, using LSD, cocaine, and heroin as a means of escape. She ran away multiple times, often disappearing for days before returning home. At 17, she married a man she had known for only a few months, believing he would be her way out of Betsy Lane. But the marriage lasted less than a year before crumbling. Natasha found solace in Gothic culture and the occult. She idolized serial killers, spoke about worshiping the devil, and saw herself as an outcast in a town where she never felt accepted. But in her group of friends, she was the leader, the one they all turned to. And when she said she was leaving Kentucky for good, they followed. Edward Dean Mullins, 19, was soft-spoken, quiet, and largely unremarkable, until he met Natasha Cornett. She fascinated him. Born in Harold, Kentucky, Edward grew up in an ordinary working-class home. He attended high school but dropped out before graduating, opting instead to pursue a GED. He had a clean record, a steady job at a grocery store, and no history of violence. So why did someone like Edward become involved in a crime so brutal? He was desperately in love with Natasha Cornett. The two planned to marry, and he was willing to do anything to stay by her side. His personality changed after he fell into Natasha's group, becoming more reckless and unpredictable. He began talking about leaving Kentucky forever, abandoning his old life for something new and exciting. What Edward didn't realize was that the path he was following wouldn't lead to freedom, it would lead to a blood-stained road in Tennessee. Joseph Lance Risner, 20, was a man full of disappointment and lost potential. Born in Hazard, Kentucky, he never knew his biological father and was raised by his stepfather, whom he struggled to bond with. When his mother and stepfather divorced, it shattered him. He turned to marijuana, LSD, and alcohol to numb the pain. Determined to make something of himself, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, only to be discharged after failing a drug test. Joseph was now adrift, with no direction and nowhere to go. He attached himself to Natasha's group, seeing them as the only people who understood his anger and disillusionment. Crystal Rena Sturgill, 18, was the one who went unnoticed, the quiet girl with the loudest pain. She was an honor student from Harold, Kentucky, interested in child care and working part-time through a school program. But her home life was a nightmare. She had been sexually abused by her stepfather, a dark secret she kept buried for years. Constantly moving between relatives, she never had a stable place to call home. Though she had no prior criminal record, her deep emotional wounds made her vulnerable. She needed an escape. She found one in Natasha Cornett and her friends. Karen Howell, 17, had a life filled with violence long before Tennessee ever made the news. Born in Delaware, Ohio, she witnessed her parents' violent marriage fall apart before she turned 10. She was sexually abused by relatives, experiences that haunted her. As she got older, she grew fascinated with witchcraft and fantasized about escaping into another world. Karen wasn't just looking for friendship, she was looking for a new reality, one where she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. Jason Blake Bryant, 14, was the youngest of the group, yet he would become one of the most feared. At just 14 years old, Jason was a troubled boy with an IQ of just 85 and the emotional maturity of an 11-year-old. His first experience with alcohol? 3 years old. By the time he was 14, he was using drugs regularly, skipping school, and getting into fights. Jason looked up to the older members of the group, desperate to prove himself. When things took a violent turn, he wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. They were misfits, outcasts, and troubled souls. Some wanted an escape, some wanted revenge on the world, and some simply wanted to belong. But on April 6, 1997, their paths would collide with an innocent family. And the result would be one of the most horrifying crimes in Tennessee history. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the Liled family pulled into a rest stop off Interstate 81 in Greene County, Tennessee. The family had just left a Jehovah's Witness convention in Florida, heading back to their home in Wisconsin. Vidar, the father, had been driving for hours and was looking forward to a brief break. They parked their van and stepped out to stretch their legs, unaware that this routine stop would mark the beginning of a nightmare. Just moments after they parked, 6 teenagers, 4 boys and 2 girls, pulled up in a green Chevrolet Caprice. They appeared harmless at first, and for a brief moment, the Lileds shared a few polite words with them. The teenagers, mostly from Kentucky, were traveling together, seemingly aimless, and were in need of a ride. What began as an innocent exchange would soon take a terrifying turn. The teens, led by 18-year-old Natasha Cornett, were in the midst of a desperate, reckless crime spree. They had no intention of simply passing through this rest area. After a few minutes, Natasha approached Vidar and Delfina, asking if they could give her a ride. Suspicious but polite, Vidar declined, explaining that they had already been on the road for a long time and weren't in a position to offer help. At first, the teens seemed to accept the rejection, But this was just the beginning. Within minutes, Natasha returned, but this time with a gun in her hand. The situation escalated instantly. The teens had made their decision. This wasn't just about a ride. They needed money, and they were willing to use violence to get it. Vidar, Delfina, and their 2 children were forced at gunpoint into their own van. Natasha ordered Vidar to drive, and the rest of the group piled into the back seat, with one of the boys, Joseph Risner, taking control of the front passenger seat. The family had no choice but to comply. The family was now prisoners in their own van, and as the journey progressed, their fear grew. The youths, most of them barely older than children themselves, held the Lilelids at gunpoint as they drove south, the highway stretching endlessly before them. They made no effort to hide their aggression or their hostility. The family was simply a means to an end. What that end would be, however, wasn't yet clear to Vidar and Delfina. They continued to drive for miles, heading further into the wilderness, further away from any chance of rescue. Somewhere along the way, Vidar, driven by panic and an overwhelming sense of responsibility for his family's safety, made a desperate decision. He managed to break free from the group's control, leaping from the van as it slowed. He ran as fast as he could, trying to escape, trying to protect his family. But his hope was short-lived. The youths quickly recaptured him, dragging him back to the van, the gunshots from inside echoing in the distance. Vidar was forced to climb back in, now fully aware that there would be no escaping. No one would save them. The group eventually stopped at a remote location off Payne Hollow Lane, a secluded, rural stretch of road far from the nearest town. The isolation of the area meant that there were no witnesses, no one around to intervene. It was the perfect spot for a horrific act to unfold. As Vidar and Delfina, along with their 2 children, sat there in fear, the killers began to take control of the situation. The youths, now fully emboldened by the isolation and the absence of any authority figures, began executing their plan. Vidar and Delfina were shot first. Vidar was struck in the chest. His life ended before he could even process what had happened. Delfina was killed shortly after, her body left lifeless in the van. Then came the children. Tabitha, just 6 years old, was shot in the head. The brutality of the act, the unthinkable loss of innocence, shattered the hearts of anyone who would later learn of it. But it didn't end there. 2-year-old Peter, left in the back of the van, was also shot. Unlike his sister, Peter's wounds were survivable, but only just. He lay, bloodied and broken, surrounded by the bodies of his family. The killers didn't linger long. The moment the crime had been committed, the group began to flee. Natasha and the others made their way back to their car, leaving the family's bodies behind in the cold, dark night. Peter, though gravely injured, was left in the van, still alive, miraculously so, but just barely. It was hours before the bodies of the Liled family were discovered, and when the police arrived, they were met with a scene of unimaginable carnage. The crime was incomprehensible, leaving investigators and the public alike struggling to make sense of it. How could something so horrific happen to an innocent family? After the brutal killings of the Liled family, the 6 perpetrators, Natasha Cornett, Joseph Risner, Jason Bryant, Crystal Sturgill, Edward Dean Mullins, and Karen Howell, found themselves at a crossroads. The once innocent family had been violently wiped out, and now the killers were on the run, knowing full well that the authorities would soon be hot on their trail. With the murders still fresh in their minds, the urgency of their escape became all-consuming. They fled from the scene of the crime without much of a plan beyond getting as far away as possible. In the early hours, as they sped down highways, the weight of what they had just done must have begun to sink in. But they couldn't turn back. Not now. They had committed something far too horrible, and their chances of ever going back to a normal life had been obliterated. So, they kept moving, southward, toward Mexico, hoping they could disappear in the chaos. However, the journey was hardly as smooth as they'd hoped. Natasha Cornett, the leader of the group, took charge, directing the others with cold determination, but even she couldn't keep their nerves in check. Along the way, the group began to crack. They argued, grew anxious, and began to realize how impossible it was to escape what they'd done. The faces of the Liled family, especially the innocent child Peter, haunted them, and they couldn't escape the feeling that time was running out. As they crossed into other states, each new border felt like a barrier they were just inches away from crossing, and each mile felt like a countdown to their capture. They had no experience in evading the law, and their recklessness began to show. In their haste, they didn't realize that they were being tracked. Back in Tennessee, the authorities had quickly pieced together the details of the crime. Investigators were able to identify the vehicle used in the carjacking, and once the murders were linked to the group of 6, they knew they were on the move. A nationwide manhunt was launched, with the FBI and local police tracking every lead, combing through every clue. As the days passed, Natasha and her group continued south, getting more desperate by the hour. At one point, they stopped at a motel, where they were seen acting strangely, nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders, paranoid about being recognized. It was clear they were running out of time. The final leg of their escape took them to the U.S.-Mexico border. They knew they had to get past the border to make their escape, but they also knew that if they were caught, it would be over. As they approached the crossing, they tried to act casual, hoping they wouldn't raise suspicion. But the Border Patrol had already been alerted about the crimes, and they were prepared. When the group pulled up to the checkpoint, their vehicle was flagged for inspection. Border agents, well aware of the nationwide manhunt, grew suspicious when the car was identified. Tension filled the air. The perpetrators were terrified, and it was clear they were trying to act normal, but their behavior was far from it. It didn't take long for the border agents to arrest them. The group was taken into custody without a fight. Natasha, Joseph, Jason, Crystal, Edward, and Karen were no longer fugitives. They were now criminals, facing the consequences of their horrific actions. As the authorities processed the group, the reality of their capture settled in. The brief moment of freedom they had tasted was over, and with it came the certainty of their fates. The authorities quickly began the process of extradition. The killers were not only facing charges for the murders of Vidar, Delfina, Tabitha, and Peter, but also for their violent escape attempt. The manhunt that had once seemed so frantic and elusive had now come to a swift end. Their capture was the culmination of weeks of uncertainty, terror, and wild attempts to outrun their past. But their escape had ultimately failed. For the killers, it was the end of the road. But for the families who had been affected by this tragedy, the questions remained. How could such young people, who seemed to have the world ahead of them, commit such a monstrous act? What drove them to destroy the lives of an innocent family in such a brutal and senseless manner? And for Peter Liled, the only surviving victim, how would he rebuild his life after the horrors he had witnessed? The escape and capture of the Liled family's killers became a shocking chapter in the ongoing story of the crime, one that would lead to a courtroom drama, legal battles, and eventual sentences that would serve as a painful reminder of the tragedy. But it was also a moment that brought the victims' families one step closer to justice, though it would never bring their loved ones back. The questions surrounding why these 6 individuals carried out such an atrocious crime would be explored during their trials. But even as the legal proceedings began, the lasting image that would linger in the minds of many would be the faces of the Liled family, especially Peter, who would grow up forever marked by the brutality of that fateful encounter. The nightmare that began with a random encounter at a Tennessee rest stop ultimately led to the courtroom, where justice would be sought for the tragic Liled family. The 6 killers, Natasha Cornett, Joseph Risner, Jason Bryant, Crystal Sturgill, Edward Mullins, and Karen Howell, were now the focus of a legal battle that would stretch on for years. In the aftermath of the murders, the killers were quickly arrested. Law enforcement pieced together the shocking sequence of events from witness accounts, forensic evidence, and confessions from some of the youths. The authorities worked fast, knowing that the brutal slaying of an innocent family would require swift justice. The 6 teenagers who committed the crime had fled the scene and driven south, making their way toward Mexico in an attempt to escape justice. However, their plans were quickly thwarted. They were eventually captured in New Orleans and extradited back to Tennessee. The media coverage was intense, and it wasn't long before the entire country became aware of the horrifying details of the crime. In those first few months following the arrests, the shocking nature of the crime and the ages of the perpetrators sparked nationwide debate. How could 6 teenagers commit such a brutal act? What drove them to murder a family that had simply stopped at a rest area? The prosecution wasted no time in framing their argument. This was no ordinary crime. It was the result of calculated, cold-blooded actions driven by a mixture of disturbed personalities and reckless influences. By the time the trial began in 1998, the country was still reeling from the shock of the crime. The Liled family murders were tragic, not only because of the senselessness of the killings, but also because of the ages of the victims. The Lileds, who were innocent bystanders, and the 6 young perpetrators who had come from broken homes and troubled backgrounds. Each of the 6 defendants was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. The trial would involve them being tried as adults, despite their youth at the time of the killings. This decision, while controversial, was seen by many as necessary due to the sheer brutality of the crime. The prosecution aimed to prove that the defendants had acted with a chilling disregard for human life. One of the central figures in the trial was Natasha Cornett, the 18-year-old who had been the ringleader of the group. Natasha, who had a history of mental health issues and had long been obsessed with violent fantasies, was accused of masterminding the entire plan. Her manipulative role in the killings would dominate much of the prosecution's case. Cornett was described as having an intense fascination with violence, particularly in the context of her obsession with Gothic culture. Evidence surfaced that she had planned the crime in advance, envisioning it as a means to escape her miserable life and gain notoriety. Natasha's personality would be pivotal in understanding the why behind this gruesome act. She had even shown her peers violent imagery and talked about fantasies of killing. The prosecution's case against Cornett was compelling. They painted her as the mastermind of the crime, claiming she manipulated the other teenagers into participating in the kidnapping and murder. In the courtroom, the chilling details came to light. Vidar and Delfina Liled had been executed almost immediately after being forced off the highway. Their 6-year-old daughter, Tabitha, died from her injuries soon after, while the youngest child, Peter, was left severely wounded, but miraculously survived. The jury was struck by the brutal nature of the crime. The cold, calculated execution of the family was described as something that couldn't be explained away by mere youthful indiscretion or lack of experience. The fact that this was not just a robbery gone wrong, but a planned execution, made the crime all the more chilling. Along with Natasha, the other perpetrators, Joseph Risner, Edward Mullins, Jason Bryant, Karen Howell, and Crystal Sturgill were all charged and tried for their roles in the murders. Risner, the 16-year-old military aspirant, was seen as a follower but still complicit in the violence. Jason Bryant, the youngest at just 14 years old, was clearly influenced by Cornett but still held responsible for his actions. The defense argued that Bryant was too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of the crime. The defense teams, particularly for Bryant and Mullins, tried to shift blame, presenting their clients as mere followers who were caught up in Natasha's violent delusions. They argued that the teenagers had been influenced by Natasha's fantasies and that their actions, while still criminal, were the result of immaturity and the mental manipulation of Cornett. Some claimed that their troubled childhoods, abuse, neglect, and isolation contributed to their descent into such violence. However, the prosecution countered these arguments by pointing out the calculated nature of the killings. The victims weren't just killed randomly. They were executed at close range, their lives taken in a cold and deliberate manner. The fact that the family was bound and shot, and that the killers had no remorse, left little room for the defense's narrative of youthful naivety. In the end, justice was served, though not without controversy. Cornett, the most culpable of the group, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her role as the leader of the group and her direct involvement in the killings meant that she would never have a chance at freedom again. The others, including Risner, Mullins, and Bryant, were also sentenced to life in prison. Jason Bryant's sentence was somewhat lighter, with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years, reflecting his age at the time of the crime. However, many felt that this was still too lenient given the brutality of the murders. The remaining killers, Howell, Sturgill, and Risner, also received life sentences, with varying degrees of eligibility for parole depending on their individual roles. Over the years, there were several appeals from the defendants, but each was ultimately rejected. In 2009, Natasha Cornett's appeal for a reduced sentence was denied, and the courts upheld her life sentence without the possibility of parole. For many, the fact that these killers were so young at the time of the crime was a hard pill to swallow. Their youth became part of the discussion in the years that followed, sparking debates about how the criminal justice system should handle young offenders. However, the brutality of the Liled murders was indisputable, and the families of the victims were left to mourn the loss of their loved ones while knowing the killers would be locked away for the rest of their lives. In the end, the trial of the Liled family murders was a landmark case in understanding the psychological profiles of young killers and how they should be treated within the criminal justice system. The legacy of the crime, however, continues to haunt not just the families of the victims, but also the larger community. The Liled family would never be replaced, and their tragic story serves as a grim reminder of the capacity for violence that exists within some young minds, even those who may seem on the surface to be innocent. After being rushed to the hospital, Peter faced a long and grueling recovery. Doctors worked tirelessly to treat his wounds, which included gunshot injuries to his face and head. In many ways, his physical recovery was just the beginning of a much more complicated healing process. As his body healed, the psychological scars left by the attack would take years, if not a lifetime, to come to terms with. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy saw Peter placed in the care of his maternal aunt and uncle, who assumed legal guardianship. His new guardians tried to provide him with a sense of normalcy, something resembling the home life he'd once known, before the violence shattered everything. His aunt and uncle, both dedicated and loving, yet their best to offer him a safe, nurturing environment. Yet Peter's loss was overwhelming. He was no longer just a child who had lost his parents. He was a survivor of unimaginable violence, with a past too dark for most to even comprehend. Peter struggled to understand the enormity of the tragedy. He was so young, and the memories of his parents and sister were fading as he grew older. His mind, still fragile, was left to grapple with questions that no child should ever have to ask. Where did my parents go? Why did these strangers hurt us? His quiet, unspoken grief was a heavy burden to carry, even as the years passed. Despite the trauma, Peter was resilient. He slowly started adjusting to his new life. His aunt and uncle's home became his refuge, a place where he could start to heal. But it wasn't an easy process. For years, Peter lived with the weight of survivor's guilt, the feeling that somehow he should have been able to protect his family, that he could have done something to change the outcome. The psychological toll of such guilt was profound, and though he didn't fully understand it at the time, he could feel the echoes of that night reverberating in his thoughts. As he entered his teenage years, Peter found it difficult to communicate his emotions. The trauma he had experienced often left him feeling isolated from his peers. He would sometimes struggle to relate to other kids who had never experienced anything remotely like what he had gone through. Yet, despite the distance he sometimes felt, Peter was still determined to make something of his life. His aunt and uncle, who never stopped showing him love and support, encouraged him to pursue his education, to take small steps towards rebuilding what had been broken. In his late teens, Peter began seeking answers about his past. The details of the night his family was murdered were still a blur in his memory, but as he grew older, he became determined to learn everything he could about the tragedy that had taken his family away from him. Conversations with his aunt and uncle helped him piece together the horrifying events, and with each new detail, Peter was forced to confront the deep scars that were left on him, not just physically, but emotionally. Though he was no longer the small, bloodied child lying on the roadside, the emotional scars he carried were still fresh. The images of his parents' deaths, the thought of his sister Tabitha, whose life was cut short so violently, haunted him. As an adult, Peter had to learn to live with the fact that he would never have the answers he so desperately sought. Why did the killers choose his family? Was there anything that could have stopped them? These questions, though difficult to answer, became a part of his internal struggle. As Peter transitioned into adulthood, he made strides to live a normal life, although his journey was anything but typical. He pursued a college education, eventually becoming a strong advocate for victims of violent crime. Through his work, he connected with others who had survived unimaginable tragedies, finding a sense of solidarity with those who had experienced loss in a similar way. Peter's work was driven by a deep desire to help others navigate the emotional aftermath of violent crimes, something he knew far too well. But even as he worked to build a career, Peter was still haunted by his past. He had learned to suppress many of his feelings, to continue on despite the crushing weight of the memories that refused to leave him. Yet, as time passed, Peter began to understand that his story, though a story of unimaginable pain, was also a story of survival. His strength, forged in the crucible of violence and loss, became his defining trait. Though he would never forget what happened, he learned to use it to fuel his desire to help others. Peter never lost sight of the memory of his parents and sister. He honored their lives in private ways, small rituals, personal moments of remembrance. He would sometimes visit their graves, placing flowers where his family lay. Each visit was a bittersweet moment, filled with grief and love, as he grappled with the past while also trying to move forward. Peter's journey as an adult was not easy. There were periods of darkness, moments when the weight of his trauma felt unbearable. But through it all, he fought to reclaim a sense of purpose. He had survived not just the brutality of that night, but also the years of emotional and psychological wounds. Today, Peter's life stands as a testament to the power of resilience. How, even in the face of the most incomprehensible tragedy, the human spirit can endure. His story is not one of simple recovery, but of a deep, ongoing process of healing. Peter is living proof that even the deepest scars can one day become a source of strength. He may never fully escape the pain of what happened to his family, but he has found a way to move forward, one step at a time. And so, while Peter Liled's life will forever be defined by the tragedy that struck his family, it is also defined by his perseverance, his commitment to honor the memory of those he lost, and to use his pain to help others in need. He is living proof that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. The tragedy that unfolded on April 6, 1997, left a lasting scar on the Liled family and the community. Vidar, Delfina, and their children were just innocent victims caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, while the 6 youths who carried out the crime faced justice, though it could never bring back the lives lost. Peter Liled, the sole survivor, has since grown into a resilient young man, carrying the weight of that fateful day with him. As we reflect on this harrowing story, it's clear that violence can strike unexpectedly, and sometimes even the smallest moments of chance can lead to unspeakable horror. The Liled family's story serves as a sobering reminder of the fragility of life and the ripple effects of violence. If you found this story as chilling and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you like to see more true crime stories like this? Let us know.